Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
And now here's my take.
He was a sick man, a demented man.
That was Donald Trump trying to explain the latest mass shooting in the United States. We hear this view expressed routinely after every new incident. But it is a dodge, a distortion of the facts, and a cop-out as to the necessary response. There's no evidence that the Las Vegas shooter was insane. You'll notice, by the way, I prefer not to use his name and give him publicity, even posthumously. We won't show his photo either. He did not have a history of mental illness that we know of, nor had he been reported for behavior that would suggest any such condition. He was clearly an evil man, but evil is not crazy. If we define the attempt to take an innocent human being's life as madness, then of course every murderer is mad. If not, we should recognize it is a meaningless term that adds little to our understanding of the problem. Actually, the quick assumption of mental illness distorts the discussion. First, it smears people who do have mental disorders. Such people are not inherently highly prone to violence. They are more often than not victims of violence than perpetrators. And to the extent that some are violent, they are more likely to inflict harm on themselves. Second, turning immediately to the sickness of the shooter and piously calling for better mental health care is more often than not an attempt to divert attention from the main issue, guns. Every conversation about gun deaths should begin by recognizing one blindingly clear fact about this problem. The United States is on its own planet. The gun death rate in the US is 10 times that of other advanced industrial countries. Places like Japan and South Korea have close to 0 gun-related deaths in a year. The United States has around 30,000. This disparity is the central fact that needs to be studied, explained, and addressed. When seen in this light, it becomes obvious why focusing on mental health is a dodge. The rate of mental illness in the United States is not 40 times the rate in Britain, but the rate of gun deaths is 40 times higher than in Britain. Now, America does have about 15 times as many guns as Britain per capita, and far fewer restrictions on their ownership and use. And this is not simply a case of America being different from the rest of the world. Data that look carefully at gun violence across America's states finds a similarly tight correlation. Those states that have some of the highest percentages of gun ownership have among the most gun-related deaths, and those with some of the lowest rates of gun ownership generally have the fewest deaths. How to tackle this issue is a more complex problem, made particularly difficult by the fact that we refuse to study it, literally. One of the main government agencies that sponsors research on public health, the Centers for Disease Control, has been virtually forbidden by law from doing any research on gun violence and public policy for 2 decades. A law championed by the NRA essentially prohibits the CDC from sponsoring research that might advocate or promote gun control. So in America, in 2017, we have a ban on scientific research that might lead to inconvenient conclusions. Given the Second Amendment, given America's gun culture, given the influence of the gun lobby, there isn't any simple answer. But there are many small fixes that might make a big difference. Universal background checks, restrictions on military-style weaponry, of which banning bump stocks would be a tiny first step, a ban on selling to people with a history of domestic violence or substance abuse. But first, we have to stop the dodges and the diversions. When you consider America's stubborn inaction in the face of this continuing and preventable epidemic of gun violence, I sometimes wonder if it is all of us Americans who are crazy. For more, go to cnn.com/Fareed and read my Washington Post column this week. And let's get started. Let's dig deeper into America's gun problem and how the world sees it with three guests, all of whom had interesting, insightful columns this week about it. Thomas Friedman is the author of Thank You for Being Late. He is, of course, also a New York Times op-ed columnist. His column this week envisioned how different it would have been if the Las Vegas shooter had been Muslim. David Frum is a senior editor at The Atlantic. His article this week for that publication was Mass Shootings Don't Lead to Inaction, They Lead to Loosening Gun Restrictions. And Leah Libresco is a statistician who used to write for 538. I'll tell you about her piece in just a moment. Tom, let me ask you what you meant when you said that this event would have been dealt with very differently if the guy had been a Muslim.
Well, let's begin by the fact, Fareed, that had this been an attack by a Muslim related to ISIS or Al-Qaeda, it actually would have been the second largest terrorist attack in America, the largest terrorist attack, I should say, since 9/11. And we know how President Trump reacts to those kind of events. We know as a society how we react. The president immediately tweets when there's a terrorist incident in Europe. He doesn't even wait for the facts and immediately politicizes them. We know he's trying to impose a ban on predominantly Muslim countries to prevent people traveling here who he thinks would commit terrorist acts. He's trying to build a wall on the Mexican border. I'm sure we would have had a nonpartisan commission to investigate how this act happened, who let these people through. We know what happens when there's an incident like this from our own history. And of course, in this case, basically nothing's happening. There's some talk of limiting the amplification mechanism this guy used to more rapidly fire bullets. But when the perpetrator is a foreign country, we immediately say, what was the country of origin and how do we attack this? And how do we prevent it from ever happening again? When the country of origin is us, then we hear no evil, speak no evil, and say no evil.
And David Frum, of course, the numbers are staggering, right? I mean, something like under 100 people have been killed in terrorist attacks since 9/11, and we have spent trillions of dollars on it. And meanwhile, something like 150,000 people have died of gun deaths since 9/11. And as you point out, gun laws keep getting looser after each of these events. Right. Why is that?
Because public opinion believes that guns make you safer. There are many illusions in this debate. One of them is that the great and good American people want gun control and are thwarted by a few selfish interest groups. Unfortunately, that's not true. The great and good American people believe, and that belief has been rising over the past 20 years, that guns make them safer. And it's just not considered politic to say the great and good people, American people, are wrong. They're wrong about that. They're mistaken. Guns are in the home are dangerous. If you keep a gun in your house, you're putting your children at risk. Suicide, accident, homicide. We restrict ourselves to certain topics because we have such a powerful vested interest. And as a result, we have reached a point where it is perfectly legal in 44 of the 50 states for a gunman to strap a weapon of war around his neck, walk to within a certain number of paces of a school, typically 1,000 paces, and so long as he doesn't take the pace to the 999th pace, no one can say anything to him. If you want to have gun safety, you have to begin with the assumption that gun ownership is a privilege, not a right, and that gun owners can be checked for the responsibility that they say they have and so often lack. David Brooks of the New York Times used your column as a starting off point, and his argument is that the reason we have this increase in support for guns is that people are confronting a kind of post-industrial world in which there's very little that gives them a sense of almost tribal emotional security, and guns play that role. Does that strike you as right? I think that's right. And one of the rules, again, of this debate is we have to act as if the desire for gun ownership is rational. No matter how blatantly the fantasies are expressed, no matter how blatantly the racial fears and the sexual anxieties. I mean, a lot of this is about reasserting a man's place in a world in which many American men feel displaced. After all, how can you be a loser if you're able to kill so many people?
Tom Friedman, you travel the world a lot. How do you think people are reacting around the world to something like this?
Well, Fareed, I want to go back to your point about David Brooks' article that this is in many ways a cultural phenomena. And I think we're facing two of those. I think the response of the very same people to the threat of climate change is also really based on culture. It's based on a certain identity marker that real men don't believe in climate change. But basically, if you step back and think about what we're saying, in the wake of the two most ferocious hurricanes in the Atlantic that we've ever recorded, that have caused now about $200 billion in damage. And in the wake of a mass killing in Las Vegas that has killed almost 60 people and wounded, 400 or 500 others, we have a party, the Republican Party, that is saying the right response to both of those things for their kids and the future of the country is to do nothing. And that is a travesty.
Well, and, as Leah, you point out, I've pointed out, there is even essentially a ban on doing any kind of research on this issue.
When we come back, so is gun control the answer? Maybe not. Leah Libresco will tell us what she found when she studied the subject. And we are back with Tom Friedman, David Frum, and Leah Libresco. Leah, you wrote an article that went viral in the Washington Post that was titled, "I used to think gun control was the answer. My research told me otherwise." Why don't you quickly summarize what you meant?
Well, when I started looking much more deeply at proposals in gun control, what I found is that some gun control proposals are simply incoherent. We saw both Hillary Clinton and Kaine this week praise limiting silencers as a response to the Las Vegas shooting, when silencers are badly named. They don't make guns silent. They make them slightly quieter, but still very noisy. And this is the kind of thing I had repeated, hearing this praised, hearing assault weapons bans praised, when assault weapons are just a gun that has too many features snapped onto it like Lego bricks at point of sale. Once you take it home, you can add them back on yourself. So those kinds of policies are just often incoherent. They sound like they're posed by someone who doesn't know anything about guns. And they erode the credibility of politicians proposing more serious solutions.
But I have to say, I looked at your article and I was struck by the fact that this is a very complicated subject and there's so many variables that it's very difficult to find a very tight correlation. But there is one mammoth study of studies. This is usually the kind of scientific gold standard in the Journal of Epidemiology, which points out that there's overwhelming evidence that tighter gun control, fewer guns, has an impact. You can see it by the fact that the United States has 10 times as many gun deaths as any other advanced country. You can see it within American states, the countries that have more, the states that have more guns versus the states that have fewer. It felt like you were trying to find a controversial conclusion and then cherry-pick the evidence to support it.
Not at all. I really believe that if there were a lot fewer guns tomorrow magically in the U.S., we'd see a lot fewer gun deaths, simply because guns would not be available to people at the moment of considering suicide, at the moment of being angry, as easily when committing a crime. But the question is, what policies could actually get us to that place? So what I looked at was policies in Britain and Australia, looking at the marginal change caused by gun bans and gun buybacks. And in both of those countries, you didn't kind of see that massive, exciting shift I honestly wanted to see. It didn't transform a country into a much lower gun prevalence country, partly because when you do a buyback, you're not sure which guns you're buying back.
But it's also because in many of these cases, in Britain, for example, the rates of violence are so low that it's almost impossible to tell what the...
Except in England, the gun deaths kept rising after their buyback. Which doesn't mean that it made it worse. It just means that whatever else was going on may have swamped whatever effect it has. But as a data person looking at this data, I would root for a clearer result from gun buybacks program. And instead, you see a rise in England after the buyback.
From a tiny number to a slightly higher
And in Australia, a drop. In Australia, a drop. But at the same time, a drop in non-gun homicides and non-gun suicides, which makes it hard for me to honestly say, I'm confident this will make a difference.
So I guess the question then becomes, how do you explain the extraordinary reality that the United States has 40 times as many gun deaths as Britain, 30 times as many as France, almost 75 times as many as Japan, other than guns? I mean, do we have 75 times more crazy people than these countries? Do we have 75 times more violent video games than these? The only thing we have more of is guns.
I do think that's a major driving factor, but the question is, when people say this worked in England, this will work in America, will it actually? If tomorrow we woke up and there'd been a gun rapture and all these guns had vanished, I would expect there to be fewer deaths. But of the actual policies being put forward, will they have the effect of making America suddenly a country that doesn't have this many guns and doesn't have the attachment to them?
David, from...
Leia's saying one thing that is true and one thing that is really alarmingly false. The thing that is false is the suggestion that there are other alternatives that would work better, that are more narrow, as she says in the article, more narrowly tailored. In fact, the alternatives to gun control are all vastly more intrusive and more coercive and more expensive. There are 20, for example, if we're going to identify men at risk, older men at risk of depression, there are 23 million men in the United States over the age of 65. That's a lot of people we have to inspect. There are a lot of domestic disputes. There are a lot of young men at risk of violence. And oh, by the way, the overwhelmingly predictive factor about those young men is race. So that means our screening is going to be highly racially loaded. The reason this debate is so complicated is because the obvious and correct answer is so politically prohibited. The intellectual debate is simple. The political debate is complicated. So my solution, and this is, I think, that is the thing in Leia's article that is true, is that the interventions that are discussed in the United States will not make any difference. The intervention we need is the beginning of a cultural change. And let me give you an example. It is legal in all but 8 states. It is legal for a mother to strap her child into a car seat, roll up the windows, and smoke a couple of packs of cigarettes. Mothers don't do that because they love their children, and even though they may. So let's start by pounding into people's heads the idea, if you keep a gun in your house because you want to protect your children, you think you're a good parent, you are in fact a bad parent. You're putting the gun at risk. If you are accumulating all these weapons because you think you're a responsible gun owner, the very fact that you're doing it proves you're an irresponsible person. Change the social view, and then legal changes will become possible.
Tom Friedman, last word.
Well, you know, I happened to read factcheck.org this morning about the Australian laws, basically. They had a mass murder there in 1996. They imposed very stringent ban on automatic weapons and other registration points, and then did a massive gun buyback. It has not been a dramatic drop-off, but it's down 20% since 1996. That's not beanbag. A country that has the most probably stringent gun laws in the world is called Japan. We have about 12,000 gun deaths a year. They had a year, a couple of years back, where they had 2. 22 for them caused a national crisis. So it can be done. I do agree. You got to find the right ways to do it, and we may not be talking about them, but it can be done. We're going to have to leave it at that. We will doubtless come back to this. Thank you all for a fascinating conversation.